From the work that you did as a PhD student and throughout your career, could you say that there are some general principles of training that favor testosterone production that somebody who's not an elite athlete could use? I've heard shorter sessions are better than longer sessions, but in rep loads, now there's a lot of parameter space. But if you were going to throw out some of the parameters that you think are most important to pay attention to for the typical person who's trying to use weight training to build or maintain muscle, lose body fat, so body recomposition, and or stay strong and healthy for sport.
It's a double-edged sword, and as much as testosterone is really stimulated by an intensity factor and also a volume factor. Now, growth hormone is a little bit different. That's largely driven by an intensity factor alone.
Oh, really? I always thought that growth hormone was driven by volume, which just goes to show you.
Maybe I've got
No. I think you're probably right. It just goes to show you that most of what's out there on the internet is completely right. Not only is it wrong, it's usually backwards. So no, trust trust your instinct because I think people just make this stuff up.
But yeah, coming back to testosterone in terms of the training strategies, it's largely driven by both an intensity and a volume factor. So if you look at many of the exercise interventions that we use to try and investigate and interrogate testosterone, it was usually a 6x10 protocol. So you touch at
6x10 meaning
6 sets of 10 repetitions, which is it's quite a large, 60 repetitions is quite a large volume for a single exercise. And that was usually pitched at about 80% of a 1 repetition max intensity.
Okay, so 80% of the 1 rep max, six sets of 10 reps separated by rest of
2 minutes. We formulated that kind of exercise protocol to really target the release of testosterone and try and drive up these anabolic environments to study the endocrine consequences. But I think that's the type of protocol that is most advantageous for driving anabolic environments.
And that was it for the workout?
Yeah, I mean we would do that in a back squat. So multi-joint, challenging exercise, multi-muscle, multi-joint. 80% load of your 1 repetition max, and then 6x10.
Is there any evidence that training slowly can offset some of the negative effects of doing a lot of volume?
Well, it's the old adage of, two responses to your question. I mean, the first one I would say, there's a difference between 10 sets of 6 and 6 sets of 10. And I think that comes back to the volume conversation. 6 sets of 10 is driving up metabolic stimulus. If you're doing 10 sets of 6, you can probably take it to a higher intensity, but you're not going to get the same metabolic load. You're not going to get the same internal metabolic environment that drives the lactate release that they will then signal, further anabolic testosterone release because of the lactate in your body. That's a key consideration. The rest is often the consideration that's overlooked out there in general population and in many sporting environments. That the rest is as important a programming variable as the load and the intensity, the load, the volume, etc. And yes, if you extend the volume, if you extend the duration of your rest periods, what you're ultimately doing is influencing that metabolic stimulus again. You're allowing the flushing of the body, the removal of waste products, lactate to be, removed from the body, and then the metabolic environment is reduced.
Understand correctly, you want to create a metabolic stress.
Absolutely.
So the way that I've been training, slow and lazy, is not necessarily the best way to go. The old adage of high intensity, short duration is probably the way to go.
Correct. And in layman's terms, if the same objective, the same training goal is just muscle tissue growth, and we're not talking about maximal strength or any of those type of parameters, we're just talking about growing muscle. If there's an athlete A and they do six sets of 10 with 2 minutes rest, and there's athlete B that does 6 sets of 10 with 3 minutes rest, athlete A will likely see the highest muscle gains, muscle hypertrophy gains, because of the metabolic stimulus that they're driving with the shorter rest periods.
What about day-to-day recovery? I mean, can the workout that you described as intense but short, how many days a week can the typical person do that and sustain progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to your training age and your training history. Obviously, there's a resilience and a robustness with an incremental training age. So, that's not a protocol that I would advise anyone to go out and start tomorrow.
They'll be mopping them off the gym
right.
floor.
But at the same time, it's also relative, right? So 80%, of your maximum at a young training age is still 80% versus, I've been training 10 years, it's still 80%. But yes, the mechanical load is going to be significant. It's just more tonnage, right? I wouldn't promote as an athlete doing that type of modality, multiple times unless you're from the realms of bodybuilding, and then you really that's the sole purpose of what you're trying to achieve. If it's just somebody, a weekend warrior that wants to keep in shape and look good, I would say, 2 times a week for a really challenging workout like that, and then flex the other types of workouts within the week to have more of a volume emphasis where you reduce the intensity, and you might just look at, larger rep ranges from 12 to 15 to 20. Another workout where you're looking at, reducing the volume but increasing the intensity and really trying to drive, a different stimulus to give you more end points of success.
Mm-hmm. Along the lines of androgens and intensity, when I think intensity, I think epinephrine, adrenaline. In the short term, and a big increase in stress hormone can lead to an increase in testosterone, like a parachute jump.
Correct.
So stress can promote the release of testosterone.
Yeah.
That was news to me.
Right.
We always hear about stress suppressing testosterone, stress suppressing the immune system, all these terrible things. But in the short term, you're saying it can actually increase the release of testosterone. Is it beneficial for people to get a little stressed about the upcoming impending event, whether or not it's a lift in the gym or whether or not it's talking to somebody that you might be intimidated to talk to, or an exam? Is the stress good for performance, or is it harmful?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I think I can only talk to, physical exertion, which is what we were exploring. And I don't want to tread on the toes of the psychologists with flow state and these types of things. From my data, certainly the greater the arousal, the higher the performance was from a physical exertion perspective. And I think that was the intriguing part of some of my findings, where there's definitely an individual biokinetics to some of these hormonal kind of releases, in as much as those guys that had the highest adrenergic response in terms of epinephrine release, norepinephrine release, also sustained force output for a longer period of the workout than those that didn't. So the individuals that had a lower stimulus of the sympathetic arousal, let's say, certainly didn't perform as well throughout the workout. There's a philosophy, there's a paradigm now for myself in terms of the exposure, repeat exposure. The more you do that challenging workout, do you get the same psychological stimulus? Do you get the same stress response? And the assumption is unlikely. You accommodate, you become accustomed to the stressor, your body will therefore adapt, and that's the classic overload principle, right? You then need to take the stressor down a different route.
Over and over, we hear that stress is bad. Stress is bad. But everything I read from the scientific literature is that stress, and epinephrine in particular, is coupled to the testosterone response to performance and to adaptation, provided it doesn't go on too long. I think the people need to know this, that discomfort is beneficial. Now, there's another side to this that I want to ask about, which is the use of cold. In particular, things like ice baths, cold showers, or any other type of cold temperature exposure. In theory, that's stress also. It's epinephrine. And so how should one think about the use of cold for recovery? So if it's stress, if cold causes stress, then how is cold used for recovery?
It's a great question. And I think, when we talk about stress, it's your classic fight, flight, or freeze approach. And throwing your body into, a cold tub, an ice bath, or whatever it may be, certainly is going to have a physiological stress response. Now, people are using that for different end goals. And again, I think that's where the narrative has to be explained. If you're using cold specifically from a physiological perspective to promote, redistribution of vascularity, of blood's flow, to different vascular areas of muscle that you feel have gone through a workout, that are damaged or whatever it may be. I think we've got to understand what that stress mechanism is. And the data, the literature is certainly still out there with respect to cryotherapy and cold baths and some of these these cold exposures in terms of what they do at the level of the muscle tissue. If that's the target, if you're trying to promote a flushing mechanism or you're trying to promote redistribution of the blood flow, what you've got to understand is that cold is going to clamp down every part of the vascular system, and we've really got to understand how the muscle would be redistributed to areas of interest. So, I think the stress response is a real thing with respect to cold exposure, but I think the narrative around what are you using the cold for has to precede the conversation.
And cold, I've heard, can actually prevent some of the beneficial effects of training, that it can actually get in the way of muscle growth, etc.
Yeah, there's some pretty robust data out there now showing that it definitely has an influence on performance variables like strength and power in particular, but absolutely in terms of muscle hypertrophy. And there's a big kind of theme in the world of athletic performance right now in terms of periodization of cold exposure as a recovery modality.
Interesting.
When do you use cold? Should you be using cold for recovery in periods of high training load when you're actually pursuing, maybe general preparatory work, where you're actually trying to pursue muscle growth? Well, that's usually where you get the most sore. It's usually where, you feel the most fatigued. But it's probably not the most beneficial approach to use an ice bath in that scenario, because you're dampening, you're dulling the mTOR pathway and the hypertrophic signaling pathway. Whereas in a competition phase, where actually quality of exercise and quality of execution of skill and technical work has to be maintained, you want to throw the kitchen sink of recovery capabilities and recovery interventions in that scenario, because the muscle building activity should be in the bank. That should have been done in the general preparatory work, and now you're focusing on technical execution. So you're absolutely right.
If I want to maximize muscle growth or power or improvements and adaptations, then the inflammation response, the delayed onset muscle soreness, all the stuff that's uncomfortable and that we hear is so terrible, is actually the stimulus for adaptation. And so using cold in that situation might short circuit my progress. But if I were to do an Ironman or something, or run a marathon under those conditions, I'm basically coming to the race, so to speak, with all the power and strength I'm going to have. And so there, reducing inflammation is good because it's going to allow me to perform more work, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to be strategic about when you use some of these interventions. And the time when you're preparing for a competition is the appropriate time when you want to drive recovery and make sure that your body is optimized. When you're far away from a competition date, or out of season or whatever it may be, and you're really trying to just tear up the body a little bit to allow it to its natural healing and adaptation processes to take place. Well, you don't want to negate that. You want the body to optimize its internal recovery, and that's how muscle growth is going to happen. So